first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Arizona, somehow I have, different good feelings with different states in the United States, and Arizona is one of them because we had a very nice social lemma conference there once that Tamar organized, and I still look back at that conference also with a lot of spirit and pleasure and enjoyment. Let's put it that way. It was really, really nice. And so, so thank you very much. And trust is, of course, very close to my heart as a topic. And for today, I do something different. It's something that this talk I gave once before, but it was still a little bit different. So we'll see how it goes. But it's a little bit meta science, and I'll show you what that means. Let's see if this works. Yes. Oh, okay. Yes. It should work this way. Yes. Okay. So basically, it's inspired in part by a book that I did with Jeff Joyman, and it's about how to publish high quality research, which is a very modest title, I know, but disregard the title for the moment. The idea there was that there are multiple paradigms for your research, and there are many roads to Rome for how to make a nice contribution, an exciting contribution. And the question is, of course, what is it that can we predict that a study will be exciting, and that you cannot always predict the findings, but can you predict a priori that a study will be exciting and make an important contribution? I must admit this is also somewhat inspired by actually JPSP. The third section once asked me this question, and we had to evaluate this whether a particular paper would have impact in the future. And that's a difficult judgment sometimes to make. But then also those criteria cross your mind. I think this topic fits with more recent approaches in the behavioral sciences, which there's more attention for theory building. How do you do that exactly? There's more theory, more attention for things like replicability or reproducibility. And there's more also attention for meta science more generally. And so this talk fits in that new approach. So the goal is basically to evaluate different research approaches that are likely to make a study interesting. And in principle, if I'm right in what I'm arguing, it should be a very important lesson in the sense that from now on, we all can design studies. That's the goal, that will have impact, that will be exciting, etc. So let me see if there are paradigms like that. One paradigm that I think is very common, and which is actually, and a close colleague of mine, Daniel Belliot, often does this, actually design a study that is a test between two theoretical explanations or two theoretical perspectives. And one example that I think that fits this reasonably well is an example by Marco van Bommel and on the bystander effect. And in this particular study, we looked at online help that people may give in chat rooms. Suppose that somebody at a certain moment, shares a very sad story, and then you can sort of provide emotional support, or at least support in that chat or not. And then the question is, one classic interpretation of the bystander effect is that people are less likely to intervene because they feel evaluated. And they might look like a fool if, for example, that help was not needed, for example. And I always felt a little bit uncomfortable with that explanation, actually, because when you look at the broader literature, there's a lot of research showing actually that you can gain reputational benefits from helping. And so in this particular study, we indeed found in a chat room, in an online situation where people can offer help by sort of listening or sharing something like, I'm sorry to hear that. Then you see that actually in this particular context, when there are more people in the chat room who can see you, the more likely it is that people are going to help. So it's the reversal of the bystander effect, because the bystander effect is often is the classic bystander effect is that the more people there are, the less people are going to help. But it's in this particular situation, the more likely people are going to help, because they may gain reputational benefits from all those people who can watch you in a chat room. So I find it nice, and I still think that if you think of the bystander effect, that you really have to take a close look at what is the behavior that you see, what does the intervention really take, to make a close analysis of that, and then you'll find out whether people can get reputational benefits from helping, or whether there's something called evaluation apprehension that actually deters people from helping. Okay, I'll skip the beer. Then another one, that's testing one explanation. That's something we often do, of course, in clean research. We want to isolate one explanation. And something that we did with Giuliana Spadaro is a study that is really interesting when you combine political science and psychology. The big idea is about trust. Is trust a top-down subject to a top-down process? So do our institutional leaders and our institutions, do they affect trust, our trust, by their own behavior? Or is it that basically, if things go not so well between people, that this is a call for example, some type of leader? And we actually, in this particular case, were really interested in a top-down process, and were indeed very able to show actually that if you're dealing with dishonest leaders, or dishonest or corrupt representatives of institutions, then that will undermine trust between people, even if those institutions are not there anymore. So it's really important how you are treated by institutions, and whether you see the institutions as corrupt or dishonest, or rather than honest or not corrupt at all. And this was a clean illustration. We used economic games, by the way, where there would be a third person that was the institution, that represented the institution, that was supposedly taking care of fair procedures, but in fact he or she was really quite corrupt, looking for personal gain. And then you see that actually the trust between the two people, basically naive about the whole situation, develop distrust in one another. So corruption is, in that sense, a very critical element, top down, to cause distrust among people, among citizens, basically. Another paradigm that I think is sort of undervalued, underappreciated in the field of behavioral science, which is actually, sometimes we call it descriptive research. And descriptive research sometimes has a somewhat of an ambivalent meaning, like it's not theoretically relevant, and so on. Whereas I think that sometimes descriptive research, just by getting some percentages of people, can be very informative. And what we did in this particular research was an experience sampling method study that used this method. And in this particular study, we were interested in what do people do if they see a norm violation. So again, a study that is also very much related to trust. And the question is, what do people do? And if they do not intervene, what exactly do they do? And we found in this experience sampling study a very interesting phenomenon, was that most people actually engaged in gossip. So they would not intervene. They would not do nothing. They just, if they had a chance, they would gossip about what they have seen. And the interesting thing about it is that in small informal groups, gossip probably has a norm enforcing function. That in small informal groups, that if people gossip a lot, they feel that other people might be gossiping about them. Therefore, they may become more acting more in line with the dominant norms, and so gossip may serve a very important function by restoring norms, perhaps, and that people are more likely to act in accordance with norms. And gossip actually is to me, a very important phenomenon. And we also found additional evidence by Kimmo Eriksson we found actually that gossip is especially normative in weird countries. So the Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic societies. If you want to see a picture of the map of the world, you see that Holland is, of course, exceptionally small, but it's a small country. You know this already. But you see that Holland and Germany and the United States are all countries where gossip is appreciated. It's as a meta norm, so people sort of appreciate it. Whereas if you look at the very extreme countries, such as Kazakhstan or Iran, gossip is not appreciated at all, and they appreciate confrontation much more, verbal transportation, or sometimes even physical confrontation. You also see that, for example, in Indonesia, in some African countries, but also in Japan, for example, the norms are a little bit different from what we see in the traditional weird countries. So gossip is actually, what I find interesting about this descriptive study, the experience sampling study that Catherine Mulher did, was actually that we found evidence that gossip is something that people do a lot. And when you dive into the literature on gossip, you see that actually people spend on average 52 minutes per day on gossiping. And who studies gossip? Well, not many people. And then you also really wonder, and then you ask the question, what are the functions of gossip if they do it so much? Is it only pleasure? No, there's maybe more to it. What is the functional value of it, etc., etc. So I think this is descriptive studies can be really informative. Also, what you can put on the research agenda, but also what you can theorize about. Another topic, another thing that is interesting, to me at least, is what are the contexts in which people are most likely to gossip? And from a trust perspective, this should not be a big surprise, because people are most likely to gossip in dyads rather than in groups. So in pairs, because you need some trust to gossip. You're not going to gossip certainly about people that you both know well, in bigger groups. You do it in dyads, you do it in pairs, and it takes a bit of care. And that's also interesting and informative, I think, in terms of what gossip means and what are the conditions under which people are most likely to do it. And again, trust plays a role. Then with Jun Wee, continuing the story on gossip, we were really interested in the idea of studying gossip in the context of public good dilemmas. And most of you know this work, I guess, by Veer and Gechter, and subsequent work, which really highlighted the important influence of punishment. If people are able to punish one another, and especially the free riders, then you will see that actually this punishment system works such that you will see a boost in cooperation, and at a certain moment you don't need to punish anymore. And if there's still the availability of punishment, then cooperation is pretty high. So punishment works really well. It's an effective tool to promote and maintain high levels of cooperation. Now, perhaps gossip can do the same thing. If gossip is as effective as punishment, that would be really nice, because punishment is costly. You have to pay a little bit to punish. But for gossip, it's less costly. You just have to talk. And you need to trust others, I guess, with whom you talk. But it's less costly. What we found in this particular study, and the idea here was basically we told people that in a public goods dilemma that other people might talk about the behavior that you're going to display. So it's a very straightforward thing. And the other thing is, well, people may punish one another. What we find in this research is, to make a long story short, is actually that the gossip system was as effective as the punishment system. The interesting thing is that the gossip system is actually more cost effective, because gossip does not take so much costs as punishment does. So in terms of efficiency or cost effectiveness, you could say the gossip system is the clear winner of the relative to the punishment system. So this is again another reason, at least in small groups, gossip is probably a very important, powerful way by which people, small groups, informal groups, regulate cooperation. So you probably do not need so much of a formal punishment system, and this is much in line with some other research that also shows that informal systems in groups can be quite powerful. Another topic, another paradigm that I think is important is to look for a construct that has been overlooked. And of course, that's not so easy, but sometimes you think of things that you see in everyday life, and you think, wow, this is sort of crazy that we haven't looked at it in our research. And of course, some topics are over-researched, you could say, and other topics are somewhat under-researched. And when I look at cooperation, the interesting thing is that there's a strong focus on costly pro-social behavior. People think of, for example, the material contributions that people have to make in public goods dilemmas, in social dilemmas. It's really, the focus is on costly behavior. And there's not so much a focus on low-cost cooperation. Think of kindness, for example, things that really can be quite important in terms of getting the cooperation going or to initiating contact. So kindness or sharing compliments or that type of thing, politeness, those are things that are much less researched in a systematic manner than, for example, high-cost cooperation, such as cooperation in social dilemmas. And this takes a bit of time to share with you this story, and maybe some of you might know it, but this is a story when my son was 11. He's a chess player, and we were in Italy, southern Italy, and in springtime, tired of the Dutch weather, and we were in springtime in Sorrento. And he was 11 years old, and all of a sudden he asked me while we were walking there on the streets, and he said, "Daddy, what do you do all day at the university?" And I said, "Well, I do games, for example." And then I explained a bit the Princess Dilemma, and I decomposed games and everything. And then he was listening, I think, but he got me talking. I was talking for 45 minutes. Every now and then I got a sign that he was not sleeping. It's hard to get to sleep when you're walking. So I just keep talking for 45 minutes. And then I had no clue, to be honest. I was just so happy that I could talk about this with my son. And even though he did not say so much in return. But then, 2 days later, we were close to Rome, and I was looking in magazines, not on the internet, but just in magazines to see what we can do in Rome. And I was there with a breakfast together with my son, and there were three cups of marmalade on the table. And I was just with my son. My wife and daughter were not there yet. And all of a sudden he asked me, "Daddy, which one would you like?" And I said, "Well, I don't like strawberry so much, so I go for blackberry." And he said, "Well, that's not very nice, Dad, because you don't leave me any choice." And that's of course true. And then I thought, okay, I thought this is a very nice idea, and I thought, okay, I'm going to turn this into a very structured control paradigm. And we call it social mindfulness, and it's basically about all sorts of attributes, and there are more attributes. Typically, there's only one unique attribute and one or three or two redundant attributes, so to speak. And then the socially mindful choice is to take one of those redundant attributes rather than the unique one. And well, that's what we did. Niels van Doesem did his dissertation on it, and since then, I don't know how many studies we have done, but quite a few studies, also international studies. I'll show that later. But what I would like to say is that this method, and we simply count the number of socially mindful choices. Sometimes we also have filler items, like, for example, 2 red apples and 2 green apples, and we have all sorts of attributes from baseball caps to food and other types of food. And the interesting thing is that, for example, we have done neuroscientific work, and you can show it in the brain, so to speak, in the sense that the mentalizing network is activated once people see the social mindful item as a choice. And people have some difficulty making a socially unmindful choice, actually, and that's also represented in in the brain that people sort of find it difficult to make that decision, but sometimes they do. So it seems almost like the norm is to be socially mindful, and which is also, I think, exactly the case in everyday world behavior, where kindness is the norm and unkind behavior is the exception. There's lots of research findings in this area of research. People are more socially mindful to people from lower social classes than from higher social classes. There's a small link with age. Small girls are more socially mindful than small boys. Lots of replicable findings in that area. But the interesting thing is that the thing that I find interesting about it, it's a choice paradigm. It's kind of a behavioral paradigm, but it's about low-cost cooperation. We don't say, if you take the green apple, that this is so much of a sacrifice. We also sometimes control for how much they value these attributes, and in fact, we even did research where there's no person after you making a choice, and then people find the red apple as attractive as the green apple. So we have done all those controls as well. This is a transparency showing cross-national variation. You can find your own country, also your own country of origin in this. Good news for Oliver, actually, Germany does quite well. In this particular study, where's Germany? Number 8 or so. But I know that in the subsequent study by Kelly Kirkland, we did exactly the same study, and we found that Germany was I think second. Japan is a classic example of a country with high social mindfulness. And what was also interesting in this later work, was that both at the level of individuals and at the level of cultures, the social mindfulness is predictive of climate change behaviors. So there is some, it taps something really, interesting. There's also a link with, for those who know social value orientation, there's also a link with social value orientation, but a modest link, because social value orientation is a bit more, theoretically speaking, a bit more about high cost cooperation. Okay, so this is about overlooking, when you have overlooked a construct in research and you introduce it, so you talk all of a sudden about low-cost cooperation. And also, what is also interesting about social mindfulness that has also been neglected in research is that you have to see it in order to do it. Some people don't see it. If you have, especially at the beginning, you don't see it, that what a socially mindful choice is. After some experience, you see it, and after some time, most people see it, not all, I think. But that's also an interesting aspect of it. Okay, then overlooked approaches. There is now more and more research on, and I think this is a very nice development. People go beyond weird. Weird has always been the default, basically, in our research, especially before the 90s, basically. But nowadays we see so many multi country studies. And one thing that I found interesting is the idea of planning culture. And in this particular paper, we talk about planning culture, that if a country has large levels of seasonal variation, you're more likely, historically speaking, to need to plan. With the emergence of agriculture, for example, you need to plan in the spring to be able to harvest in the fall, for example. And so we had some idea that for countries who are closer to the equator, there would be less of a planning culture because the seasonal variation is less, because the climate has less variability than in countries further away from the equator, where you have, for example, tough winters and hot summers, and where you really need to plan. Well, planning culture was a big thing in this approach, and just to tell you one study that we did in this tradition. I'm a soccer fan, and I found it already somewhat interesting that the hiring and firing of soccer coaches is a big thing, and especially in Southern Europe, by the way. And they are hired and fired very often. And so, at a certain moment, I thought, okay, let's take a closer look. And is it really true that in countries closer to the equator, are soccer coaches more quickly hired and fired, and being a little bit less planful in those things than in countries farther away from the equator? And so we included countries, Amsterdam and Manchester United, for example, from the northern part of Europe, and Napoli and Real Madrid from the southern parts. And we did find indeed a very interesting association, such that the turnover in coaches was higher in countries that were closer to the equator. We also find, by the way, and this is inspired a little bit by my personal experience. We have a lot of international students, and the international students coming from countries that are warmer, so to speak, and also closer to the equator, they often complain about the Dutch being so concerned about time. Like, for example, if you want to go out for a drink, the Dutch would say, oh, let me get my calendar. Maybe in 3 weeks, Tuesday at 4 o'clock, I can do it. That type of thing. And now I have done a study on this, and we call it social planning. And again, we find evidence for this. And there are cultural features that also help to explain it. But also there's a zero order correlation with the distance from the equator. So it's interesting that at a certain moment, you want to take a look at the kind of ecological features that might help you to explain where culture comes from. And in a way, this sounds controversial, but I think in terms of cultural evolution rather than biological evolution. I think in terms of how a culture adapts to those ecological circumstances. And this is also present in the other paradigm that a close colleague of mine, Evert van der Vliert, looked at, and he basically talks about all sorts of habitats, and basically climate is really up there, and the ecological variation is up there, and that would shape, for example, the socioeconomic environments and also the proximal environments. And we, of course, as well, behavioral scientists typically focus on the mindset and practices, and maybe proximal environments, but hardly ever go more up in that sort of hierarchy of where culture may come from, or how we can explain behavior, where the origins are. And for example, it raises all sorts of puzzles. For example, aggressiveness is not equally distributed in the world. The same holds for happiness, life satisfaction, etc. There are lots of traits that are not equally distributed among the world. And the interesting challenge, of course, is how can we explain it? Is there something beyond wealth that helps explain this? These very robust patterns. So this raises new questions. I have to take a look at time. Yeah, just okay. Because now I get to two paradigms that I think this one is very shocking. I tell you now already, the results will be shocking if you do not know them already, and I think the chances that you know it are maybe slim. So let me take the time for it. We all know Milgram, the famous obedience study. There's some debate about it, and some people say, well, they are not. The conclusions are not all that valid, and there's good reasons for it. It also depends on what you conclude from that research. But in this particular case, we focus on the question of examining what people do and what they say they would do, and that's a paradigm by itself. I think that is. If you find big discrepancies, that's of course very exciting. But even if you find a lot of consistency, that is also very informative. In this particular study, we call it Milgram 2.0, and it's a description of a study on sensory deprivation, a very unethical study where people would be put in a dark room, they will be locked, And that's the cover story. We are interested in sensory deprivation, but we also share that, what happens is actually that people get panicked. The cognitive abilities were impaired temporarily. Some experiences, some people experience visual and auditory hallucinations. And so most people said it's a truly frightening experience. And now we ask the question to students in the Netherlands, by and large students, and we ask them, could you write a favorable endorsement for this study? Because we want to pass this study through the ethical committee. So it's a very unethical request. It's pretty clear. And so if you obey with this request, it's clear that this is very unethical. But people had three options. They could obey, lying, and so very unethical. They could not obey, not do it. I'm not going to do it. Or they could blow the whistle, and there was a little mailbox, and in which they could put a note and say, "Well, this study by Van Lange and colleagues is very unethical. I explicitly want to note that you should not approve of this study." And so we did it also with the help of Phil Zimbardo, who had some interesting advice, especially when it came to the specifics. But there were some interesting differences from the Milgram studies. There were no shocks involved. And an important difference was they had time to think, even 7 minutes, and they wrote the endorsement in a computer. So the experimenter would be gone. So they were by themselves for 7 minutes, and to write this endorsement, or to simply not to do it, or to write a little note for the mailbox to show that to be the whistleblower. And we ask a separate group of people to indicate what they and also what the typical or most free university student would do in this situation. Okay, are you ready for the results? Face to face, I could of course do a quiz. Now I'm not doing it, but let's just see the findings. Well, what do people think they would do themselves? This was a different group of around 125 people. Well, most people say, I'm going to blow the whistle. I'm the ethical guy. I'm going to break it. I'm going to nail Van Lange down here, and so he will get caught. Another one is, and still 30%, a little bit more, would not obey, and still almost 4% would actually lie. Now, and then the question is, what would other people do? The average student at my university. Then you get, of course, already a very different distribution. They think that 1 out of 5 people would obey, would lie, much more than, of course, that what they would do themselves. And they also think that there are quite a few whistleblowers, and even more people who would not obey. But what did people actually do? Are you ready? It's amazing. It's more than 75% who basically lied, and for a very it's just incredible. I have to admit that Niels van Doesem, who ran this study, he's a very representative, and he's immediately a likable person. He was also somewhat older than the average student. We created the ideal circumstances for lying, but nevertheless, you see what the percentage of lying is. It's just incredible. The other thing that I would like to highlight is that if 10% in everyday life would blow the whistle, that means that many unethical behaviors will probably see the day of light. Or is it the light of day? Sorry. That's kind of the positive news. But the overwhelming message here is, of course, that people are not very good in those situations to predict what they might do. And I think that the power of reputation is so strong. You don't want to, you're concerned about your image that you have towards the experimenter, which is such a nice man, etc., somewhat older, respectable. And in that situation, you do not want to do it, even though you have 7 minutes alone to do that. But you know that this experimenter comes back to see what you have done. Now, to finish this story, the television in Holland was also interested in this study, and we did the study again with 7 people. And I was watching the people through a one-way screen. And out of those 7 people, they knew in advance that they would be on television. And again, we found that 4 people lied. So 2 people did not lie, and we had 1 whistleblower. Ideal for television. Now, the other thing that I can share with you, that's not in our publication, but that's really interesting to know. Niels van Doesem told me that, you won't believe it, Paul, but I can smell whether they lied. And because they become so sweaty that you could almost smell after those 7 minutes when you come back whether they lied or not. I was with the television crew. I was looking at through the one-way screen, and I saw a lot of spots. This is a very stressful situation for them, even though they lie. And so it's a very interesting case, and I see this as evidence very consistent with some of Milgram's findings, but then in a domain that is more realistic. There are bosses who would ask you to lie, for example, and there are supervisors who may ask you to engage in some unethical behavior, and these things are part of everyday life. So it is an interesting study, and I think that, to be honest, maybe in advance you could predict that this would be an interesting study with interesting implications. Okay, then maybe somewhat everybody probably agrees with this. The focus on actual outcomes and behaviors is of course also very important to realize. I think, especially sociology, traditionally speaking, has focused too much on self-reports and not the actual thing. And of course, that's especially important for things like pro-social behavior, but also for things like how we deal with refugees and all sorts of behavioral change. I would like to go to the final thing, which is also interesting. I think I know from experience that a lot of people find this interesting, so I say this with some confidence. And this is, if you find a topic that matters to nearly anyone, then that, of course, is also very important. And then people are really interested in relationships, even though there may be some variation, and people are interested in how to get happy. So if you combine those, that's of course also very important. And we ask the question: for whom do romantic, in Dutch we call them for often stable relationships, for whom do those relationships, stable relationships, romantic relationships, matter more, for men or for women? Now, it's a topic that matters. We all know women talk much more about relationships than men do. They also read more novels and fiction about that. And also they are more likely to watch movies about romance. So the prediction may be forthcoming. Women are more relationships matter more to women than to men. But actually, we find the opposite. Stable relationships, romantic relationships matter much more to men than to women. In fact, we did a really, we took 2 years or more actually to provide a review of that whole literature, and we found that actually men expect more benefits from relationships. They are more likely to say "I love you," and also be the first one to say that than women are. They are much more actively looking for a relationship. They gain much more mental and physical health benefits from romantic relationships. For example, once a relationship has ended, independent of who ended the relationship, men are much more likely to feel lonely than women are. Women are twice as likely to initiate breakup. And men suffer much more from breakup, independent of who breaks up, than women do. Men also, after breakup, are much more likely to seek contact with the former partner and to still be friends, kind of, and maybe with some other expectations as well. But the interesting thing is that men really are more dependent on relationships, on stable romantic relationships, than women are. And by the way, we think there are 2 small explanations. One is the sex drive of men is a little bit stronger than among women. So that's a small explanation. Another explanation is that in terms of all sorts of practical things that you do in the household, men have the somewhat better deal than women have. So that's also one reason that men might find a stable relationship more advantageous for them than for women. But we think the most important interpretation is the following: is that women are much more likely to have a best friend, and maybe more than one best friend with whom they share some intimacy and with whom they provide exchange emotional support. Men are much less likely to have that. So men are, in that sense, more dependent for emotional reasons, for psychological reasons, on their close partner. That is the model that we advance, and this is also in part due to how we are socialized as men and women, even from as young children already. That to have an emotional bond with others is much more pronounced among girls than among boys. Also, girls are much more likely to engage in one-on-one contact than in group interactions, for example. So there's a lot of that. But the question is, of course, why then do women talk more about relationships? We haven't solved that paradox yet. Well, it seems to be the case that women are much more likely to take a very careful decision. They are more selective. When you look at research, there's evidence for this. Actually, women set higher standards. They use more attributes before making a relationship, especially for longer-term relationships, than men do. So that's an interesting finding, very consistent with this. And also, for men, for women, the stakes are in a way higher. Evolutionary, you could say, well, they have to deal with the 9 months of pregnancy, and then you really depend on your partner. Again, trust is in that sense for women more important than for men, that type of trust. And also, when you look at abuse, men are much more likely to engage in abusive forms of norm violations than women are in relationships. So that's another reason to be very selective as a woman than as a man. So that's the reason why there is a prince on a white horse, that the women are much more likely to fantasize about the ideal partner, but there's never a princess on the white horse. So you can explain this also with this logic. So that women go to movies and talk about romance and everything is not because they are more interested in relationships. They are more interested in talking about the ideal partner. That's the idea that we advance as a post hoc interpretation for this paradox. Okay, lots of I'm going back to okay. Well, there are many roads to Rome, but I do think you can have a priori criteria by which you are able to predict whether your research question, whether it's literature research sometimes or empirical research, whether this is going to be exciting or not, and making a very nice contribution. I think but there are many roads to Rome. And I think that some of the things that we underappreciate is descriptive research. As I noted earlier, gossip is a very interesting case in point. Well, I also talked about the importance of behavioral studies and also to think of innovative methods to study behavior. I think there's a lot of things we can still do there. And we are also, at least when I talk to social psychologists, I think social psychologists are also appreciated for it, for some innovation in theorizing, but also sometimes in the methods that we develop. Okay, then there's adversarial collaboration. I would like to highlight. It's very important. I think that is a recipe for something that is solving problems, scientific debates, etc. is of course a very interesting path that you can follow to get some exciting research going. Going beyond weird is important, and so my take-home message is that we have to go for grand theorizing a little bit more integration from the mechanisms to behavior and outcomes, from incremental research to exciting studies. I'm not against incremental research, by the way, but just I think that it's nice to complement those with the exciting studies. And then the cross-sectional research with the past, present, and future, and also that we go beyond the weird societies. And with that, I thank you.